Coming to you today, way ahead of where we want to be in the class because I need to start thinking about getting you guys some books. Even though we won't actually start reading until we're finished with the American definition essay, that is actually pretty close. It's about a month away, and I need to make sure that we have enough books and that you can get your hands on them and all this other good stuff. So we do have some options this year on how we're going to approach books. I have three books. We as a whole group are going to pick a book. If we get down to two that are pretty close and one that's pretty far away, I might do another poll. But this is a good time to kind of to figure out which book we want to read. So without further ado, let me talk about the three books that we have as options. So the first book is Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and let me tell you a little bit about Huck Finn. It's written post Civil War, but it's set pre Civil War, and that's really important because it is a story about a young, very poor, what we would call today white trash boy who tries to escape his father and ends up helping out a runaway slave named Jim. And it's about their crazy adventures as they try to get free of the society that is pinning them down. So some positives why we might want to read this really important book. And I understand when I say important book, we almost cringe, right? So some positives. One is I am a huge fan of this book, and I'm also a huge fan of Mark Twain. I've written several papers on Huck between my undergraduate and even my last master's degree. And so I do feel like I have a great deal of insight into Huck that most high school teachers and even some college professors probably don't. So it's a good opportunity to hear from somebody who knows a lot about this book and can kind of teach you some of the twists and turns in an interesting way. Um, Huck is also one of the most substantial books in American literature. So, Ernest Hemingway, who kind of becomes, not the next Mark Twain, because Mark Twain was funny, but Ernest Hemingway, who becomes like one of the next pillars of American writing. He actually says that all of modern American literature comes from Huck Finn. George Saunders, my current favorite author, writes a really interesting introduction on Huck Finn that we'll read if we get Huck. And he kind of talks about how pretty much every American writer like tries to rewrite Huck Finn. Like that's where most writers kind of go to try to rewrite a story. And so it really has this powerful, you know, backdrop underneath it that really gives leverage. If you're interested in literature, if you're interested in American literature, Huck Finn is like one of the essential books that you really have to read. Delves into slavery, the South, moral issues, religious issues, common sense. It's deeply satirical and like a really good satire. It just cuts its way through everybody. Like, are you genuinely religious? It's going to cut you. Are you somebody who's agnostic? It's going to cut you too. And so it's kind of vicious in that way. And if you get behind that deep sarcasm, that deep satire, then it's a book that rewards you a lot, often a lot. It has a lot of laugh lines. It has a lot of good dark humor, and there's a kind of nature to this book that's very sweet underneath all of these very big problems. So those are the positives of Huck. The negatives, the dialogue is pretty thick. You have to pay even more attention to the dialogue because there's this very deep dialect inside of the book. Twain even makes fun of himself in the introduction of the book about how thick the dialect is. So it's kind of hard to catch some of those jokes, especially because you guys are so removed from the content. And unlike myself, who's not only read the book before and kind of knows the jokes as they're coming, I also have a sense for like who these people are. what the history behind the book is. So it'll be harder for you to catch them, but I think it's rewarding, kind of, again, having somebody with some experience looking through it. The book is repetitive in nature. I would say actually that is something that happens in a lot of American literature of this time, and it's not the only book that we will look at that has a repetitive nature. But there is kind of a, are they on the raft? Are they off the raft? Are they on the river? Are they off the river? And when they're off the river, they want to be on the river, and when they're on the river, they kind of want to be off the river. So there's a lot of that kind of going on. A very serious problem with Huck is that it uses a lot of racial slurs, explicit use of the N word very, very often. It's definitely a conversation that we have to have about how to talk about it. This is going to be even more problematic this year as we're, planning to do like a marathon reading online. Just making sure that everybody knows the rules for, not saying that word or using the expression N word. And, how are we going to talk about it? There's a lot of humor at the expense of slaves and African Americans, and really kind of anybody who's an other, that are problematic. And I think, while there's a lot of rich conversation to be had with, should we condemn Twain because he is using racism as a joke, or should we uplift Twain because he's smart enough to show us that we're being terrible if we're being racist? Um, how does that work? And again, I think there's rich conversation to be had there, but certainly a good reason not to read it is if we don't feel like we're up to that conversation. Uh, Scenes of deep physical and psychological abuse are seen throughout the book. So, again, not like that is not a part of almost all American entertainment, but it's hard to read. There are parts of it that are very hard to read when you're dealing with the abuse of people who can't really protect themselves. All right, The Grapes of Wrath is our second selection. It's written by John Steinbeck, and we'll get into a lot of things about The Grapes of Wrath. The Grapes of Wrath is a perfect example of like a book that I read in high school that we kind of just had to read. It's kind of like part of the list of books that you kind of are supposed to read. And I did not do a good job reading it. I thought it was the most boring thing I'd ever read in my life. And then I started thinking about using it for this class, and I reread it, maybe a decade ago now. And I was like, man, this book is amazing. I just didn't have a teacher who was invested in teaching it. So believe me, I'm very invested in teaching whatever book that we read, and I think we'll have a lot of fun with that. So positives, it's a deeply realistic look at the Dust Bowl. I think you'll actually be just about to be at the Dust Bowl by the time we read the book, so it'll parallel really nicely with your history class. I mean, Huck will too, but this in kind of a different way. Um, so the Dust Bowl, it really talks about who profited from the Dust Bowl as well as who suffered from the Dust Bowl. And it's going to look and investigate these themes of like, should we be sympathetic to people who have nothing? What does Western migration and expansion look like? Western should be capitalized there. What is community? What is socialism and communism? And I think really getting to know these things in a way that, um, for example, let's just look at the word socialism and communism. So many people in our country don't know what those words mean. They just know that they've been conditioned to not like them. And you can absolutely not like socialism and communism at the end of this book, but you'll know why you don't like them. You won't not like them just because they're names and of things that are said to be evil, right? You'll actually understand why some people might think that they're evil. Just like I think you'll understand why some people are like, we should be a socialist country. So you kind of get to know that through characters and through real storytelling. That's Twain in the background. Steinbeck, wow, so many emails and things. So Steinbeck uses this really interesting structure throughout the book. He's going to start with um, giving us this like chapter that's all symbolic, like the whole thing is symbols. I apologize for all the pop-ups. And then he's going to give us a chapter that's narrative. And then he's going to pick up another chapter that's all symbolic. And he mixes them in this really interesting way so that the symbol chapter is kind of pre-telling what's going to happen in the narrative chapter. And then when we read the narrative chapter, like it all kind of like clicks in, it triggers, and it becomes, pretty powerful to see these. There's a particularly powerful scene that is about the world turtle. And like, man, once you read that world turtle chapter, the world is never the same because we're all on the back of a turtle. Grapes is often pointed to as John Steinbeck's greatest work. When you think of these people who just uphold the American canon, unfortunately, they're almost all white guys. At least at this point in their writing. But Steinbeck is one of the greats, and this is heralded as his greatest work. For those of you who happen to read Of Mice and Men in your freshman year, this is Of Mice and Men on steroids, and it's like Of Mice and Men the way he wanted to write it. So it's deeply invested in these ideas of what it is to be American and what it is to be downtrodden. It was a National Book winner in 1939. He won the Pulitzer as well for fiction, and then he went on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature later in life. This is kind of the book that got him all of those awards. It's deeply tragic. It's powerful. It is a tearjerker. It's also it's much longer than the other two books, but we can do that. We can do longer if we need to do longer. So I'll talk about that when I get to the negatives. So yeah, when I said longer, it's hella longer. It's 460 pages. The others are closer to 320 to 360. So it's another 100 pages that we'd have to read. I don't want that to be the sole thing that you want to look at. However, it's something to consider. I don't want to downplay another 100 pages for you. It fits nicely into this literary theme of writing deeply depressing moralistic stories. So I'm not going to lie, it's a deeply depressing moralistic story. And if you're not down for that, then Huck is lighter in all of its tone because it's a comedy. Um, Lincoln and the Bardo is funnier because it is also a comedy. This is not a comedy. It is a deep, deep drama. Unlike other books where characters kind of like learn the moral and the audience infers it, like Steinbeck is like, nope, you have to learn the moral. You, reader, have to understand this moral. And so he grinds it into you in a very unpleasant way. But if he didn't do that, then you wouldn't get it. So that's another thing. It also drags its feet at some point. It feels repetitive. It's very overly detailed, and so it has that in common with Huck as it's a repetitive, but it's much more repetitive than Huck, I would say. Really, because it has another 100 pages to be repetitive. Lincoln to the Bardo is our last book selection. It's the book that I've taught over the last 2 years since I introduced it. And really, Lincoln the Bardo is a very interesting book. It is the contemporary book of the three. So it was written in 2016 or 17, but it's written about the Civil War era. So it takes place in the 1860s. Saunders really takes you through a huge range of emotions. So there are really laugh out loud moments in this book, like almost from page one. There are moments that will break you down, like you will be forced to cry during some of those moments. Because man, there are some moments that are so sad in this book. They really kind of bring out something interesting in you to kind of have that range of emotions. Um, we have to think about the big question, like what is the meaning of life? What does it mean to be alive? Those are the questions that really hit you in this book. So it's a deeply philosophical and sophisticated book. It's also deeply sentimental and empathetic. George Saunders is kind of known as being this great empathetic hero. I don't say that lightly. Like he's really kind of known as this empathetic being, and that's pretty amazing. Like we don't get a lot of people like that, much less a lot of writers who are like that. And so he puts his characters through the paces, but everything you can tell he really cares about his characters in a different way than Steinbeck does, or even that Twain does. Although it's hard to be less than deeply empathetic with Huck Finn as well. It's set during the Civil War, like I said, written in 2017. It's heavily researched, so he actually gives us like whole sections of these really deeply historically referenced pieces, and then he gives us kind of like this little more modern version of the past where he's using more modern language. So sometimes he kind of gets to that harder language, but it's definitely the easiest book to read on a sentence to sentence level. It reads lightning fast. I think I read it the first time I read it in 2 days. Mr. Jennings, I think, read it in two sittings in one day. So it reads lightning fast. Now, granted, I mean, I wouldn't compare anybody to Mr. Jennings as far as reading speed, um, but this group, I have not responded to them all day. They probably think I'm a slacker. Um, it's also highly awarded, and again, I think written by one of the most important writers of the 21st century, and somebody who comes from like the traditions of Twain and the traditions of Steinbeck in a lot of different ways. It'd be fun to read all three of these books together, actually, but we don't have the time or the energy to do that. Negatives, there's no explicit sex, at least that you'll pick up on, but there's a good amount of sex jokes, and we'll just have to kind of understand that and move past it. It hasn't really been a problem for other classes. In the past, it's kind of been a thing of fascination. He definitely, uses sex in a joking way a lot, but we don't talk about this stuff in high school very often. So it can be uncomfortable for some of us. That being said, I think it's usually kind of a selling point where I'm like trying to put up an explicit warning and everyone's like, ooh, that's the one to read. So I don't read it for that reason, read it for other reasons, but that's something that's in there. It does not look or read like any novel you've ever read. There are so many characters. It's really hard to keep track of everybody. The beginning is super confusing because he does not lull us in. He just immediately snaps his fingers, and we're in this kind of strange place. Um, yeah, don't worry about moving the course around. Obviously, this whole semester we're moving the course around. But the beginning can be very, very confusing, and it's something like I'll have to walk you through. Like we'll have to figure out how to do small groups or something so I can walk people through different sections of the book. Discussions about this book are going to be religious. Like we have to talk about religion when we talk about this book. So another thing that we don't usually talk about in school, and we have to be kind of aware that other people feel differently about religion than we do, and so there's a level of respect that we have to show there that is even different than the conversation about like racist language, because at least with racist language we none of us want to use the N word, but here we're going to have some people who are like, well, this is how I feel about religion. And so this book can't really be, and I don't want to think about it that way. And we're going to have to break through that to really get what we want out of it. So Saunders wants us to talk about religion as opposed to Huck, which suggests religion is foolish, so we don't want to talk about it. And there will be some things where I like have to tell you, like, I don't know. I don't know if we have any Buddhists in the class this year, for example. So I might have to explain a lot of Buddhism to people because that's a central tenet of a lot of the book. Um, so there you go. Those are our three choices. Um, Again, Huck Finn, Grapes of Wrath, and Lincoln in the Bardo. We want to make that choice probably by, let's say, October 12th, which I think is Monday, so I can get the ball rolling with getting books. If we have a tie come Monday, then we'll just have kind of a lightning round where I go down to the last couple, and we'll go from there. Um, all right, sounds good, everybody.